Welcome to the Clinical Research Podcast, bringing you the latest developments in research explained by our world-leading clinicians, academics and scientists based in Nottingham. When you Google photos of clinical researchers, you tend to get a lot of men in white coats looking down microscopes or possibly doing things involving pipettes and petri dishes, and generally they look as though they're probably meant to be medics. But increasingly, clinical research doesn't have to involve either microscopes or medics, and more researchers are people like physios, OTs, nurses, midwives and other therapists, often collectively known as the Allied Health Professionals or AHPs. I talked to Vicky Booth, one of 3 AHP clinical academic leads at Nottingham University Hospital's NHS Trust, about how she's been involved in setting up fellowships to encourage other non-medics into research, and asked her about what first piqued her own interest.
My whole research kind of portfolio started off with me treating dementia patients in the Falls Clinic that used to be over at City Hospital, that I still remember the chap came in and I'd given him the exercises, I'd done everything that I would normally do with my other Falls patients, and it just wasn't working with him. And his wife came in the next time and just said, just can't get him to do the exercises. It's just so difficult. I have to literally stand over him and tell him to do them. So all the mechanisms that we had for our non-cognitively impaired people, where you'd give them a set of exercises, tell them to do it, and then they'd mostly do them, just didn't work for this chap. And it was like, why is this not working? And so I knew that when somebody had a cognitive impairment, you had to do more, but the service wasn't always kind of set up for that, and we didn't have the guidelines for that. We didn't have the support to support me as a physiotherapist delivering that for that patient. So as clinicians, we know what the problems are and what the right kind of research questions are too. So we're the ones that should be doing the research on it.
I'm just trying to get at your thought process of, because you said that was a sort of almost like a light bulb moment for you about this was how we could do it. So you found out from his wife that he just wasn't taking enough time, or how did that evolve into almost a formal research question, I suppose?
Yeah. So what that kind of highlighted were that there were challenges to the kind of the standard interventions that we were giving our Falls patients, and that we needed to know more about, well, actually, why was it more difficult for this particular person? And that's quite often how a lot of research starts, with that one kind of case study, or that kind of one light bulb moment, or that new case, or that new condition that somebody comes across. And so that kind of, in a way, that didn't spark my project. What that sparked was my frustration and my wanting to know more about what the evidence was and why there wasn't the evidence in that area. So that kind of sparked me on my journey of getting further qualified in research methods, so that I would be able to do that project. I would be able to kind of go back and kind of look further. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And I guess that's then led you to where you are now. And so moving on to talk about the fellowships, I guess that's a way of saying, how can we spread that practice? How can we get more people involved like that?
Yeah, so at NUH, our research and innovation department are really supportive of non-medical researchers and early career researchers in those allied health professionals, nursing and midwives. So we, as clinical academic leads, along with our Institute of Nursing and Midwifery Excellence colleagues, approached R&I about getting some kind of pump priming funding for 4 of our non-medics to be able to have some research time, to be able to pursue some of those activities that they need to be doing as early career researchers, but with clinical time and working full-time clinically, they don't necessarily have as much time to be able to be doing that. So that little bit of seed funding, in a way, to give them that bit of head start. So we've worked in collaboration with the Institute and with our nursing midwifery colleagues kind of all the way along. We've got a really strong collaboration as a group of non-medic researchers and research leads in the trust. And so we approached R&I for that funding, and they agreed. And so it was a bit of a kind of pilot one-off to see what would happen and to see how it would go. And it was incredibly successful, which we're really pleased about, and are currently in the phase of just reviewing and evaluating it, because what we want to do is to be able to say, okay, well, with X amount of money, look at what your non-medical researchers can do with it.
It's often with clinical research, people tend to think it's to do with the, people looking at stuff down a microscope, cellular things or imaging or that. And this sounds a lot more real world and practical.
Yeah, so within the trust, we're getting more healthcare professionals, so more non-medical researchers gaining their research qualifications. So a lot of people have got research masters or got masters in research methods. And we've had a steady rise in numbers of non-medics gaining their PhD qualification as well. And so we want them to stay in the trust, because we want them to be doing their research within the trust. They're clinicians by background, so they're the perfect people to be doing clinically focused research. And so the idea came from trying to give those postdocs a bit of time and kind of funding within the trust to do their clinically focused research. So what typically happens, and what has happened in the past, is that because there hasn't been any of that support or any of those pathways for clinical academics, for non-medical clinical academics, somebody has that frustration as a clinician, does some research training, and then goes into an academic institution. And what we want is those really valuable people to be in our organisations doing the research within our patient populations, getting the benefit of having not only that study, but also kind of that whole culture of research within the organisation as well.
So let's talk just briefly about the 4 fellows who've had this year, and what's their projects and how did they come to those as examples?
We had 4 fellows. We had 2 nurses and 2 allied health professionals. So our nursing colleagues was a lady called Deborah Ashton, who her research is within respiratory, which was really fortunate for the past year, kind of lots of respiratory research going on in the trust. And a chap called Taka Marufu, who works in the Children's Hospital and is really interested in pathways around kind of complex discharges, so discharging complex patients. And then our 2 allied health professionals are a chap called Paul Matthews, who is a musculoskeletal physiotherapist and has done a lot of work on ankle fractures. And our 4th was a lady called Caroline Costigan, who is a diagnostic radiographer who has done phenomenal work in her area and about really encouraging research radiography. There's a lot of research radiography that happens within the trust. So they were given a day a week over 12 months to be able to focus on building up their research portfolio. So about submitting a grant or a fellowship application, about taking on research responsibilities within the trust, so becoming a principal investigator. So they had to undertake the training to become a principal investigator, which is very difficult in a pandemic when nobody is delivering training. So they did very well. All 4 of them got that training. They also had to act as a mentor or a supervisor for somebody else. So there's that thought, is that as an early career researcher, you're not only doing your own research, you're kind of building up people to support that research, kind of growing and building. So they had to take on that kind of supervisory or kind of mentorship role. And we also wanted them, so the 4th kind of outcome was about developing a network with a local education institute. So either by getting a honorary appointment or by getting a academic appointment, which is quite difficult to get. So those kind of honorary appointments are kind of the way that we go through. So they had those 4 objectives which they were really focused on, because we knew that if we give them quite targeted focuses, that we'd be able to say, yes, they've done it, or no, they haven't.
They picked a hell of a year to do it, didn't they? Really. How did they get their PI experience?
We started off with the training, and the training actually got cancelled 3 times. So we arranged it 3 times, and we actually worked with the Clinical Research Network in the East Midlands to deliver the first virtual principal investigator training, which they then use that as a blueprint and have kind of been delivering virtual training as well.
Well, I was just going to say, because the assumption often is that if it's a PI or somebody instigating research, it's going to be a medic, isn't it? Because that's sort of historically been the case. What do you think what would you say to somebody who isn't a medic, but maybe has a kernel of a half-formed idea about something, or just a general idea that they would like to see what this research thing is all about?
Yeah, so there are loads of opportunities, and you quite correctly, that a lot of principal investigators are consultants, are medics, because a lot of the research that happens is about drugs or about medical devices, which you do need that consultant or that medical qualification. But there's so much research that could be done and should be done outside of that. So one of my specialisms is within rehabilitation. And as a physiotherapist by background, it's the physiotherapists that lead that rehabilitation. So why should we not be leading those research trials and developing knowledge and building the evidence base around the practices that we're doing every day? So there's lots of opportunities for people to get into research, so kind of research delivery roles, and that's something within the trust that we're looking at as well. And that's something that our nursing colleagues have really led the way in. So people like Jo Cooper and Louise Bramley have really kind of been doing such fantastic work at building up those research delivery roles, but also looking at how researchers can also be research leaders as well, and how non-medics can be research leaders. So again, following the footsteps of our nursing colleagues as an allied health professional, clinical academic lead, we've been looking at how we can get physiotherapists and occupational therapists and speech and language therapists and that whole array of allied health professionals doing some of those research delivery roles. So that's kind of one way into it. But then you also have this big kind of training element as well, about getting your master's or your PhD or an MPhil, and then kind of post-PhD, postdocs and those kind of things. So there's lots of opportunities for that kind of research leadership, but then also that kind of just doing research on the ground and being part of studies. And one thing that we always encourage our AHP colleagues to think about is that a lot of the work that they're doing is fundamentally based in research. They're either doing evidence-based practice, or they're reading guidelines about what they should be doing in practice, or they're kind of getting their journal that drops through the door every month that talks about kind of the latest studies that are going on. So things like journal clubs, or kind of reading, just reading the kind of the magazines and the journals that come through. But they're also doing a lot of audits or kind of service evaluations where they're testing things or trying things out that have come from evidence, which isn't classically research, but actually that's kind of where that kernel of an idea comes from, and that it can kind of build and grow from there, really. So at NUH, we're really lucky because we've got research and innovation here has supported non-medical research growth and have appointed an AHP clinical academic lead. So there are currently 3 of us that are sharing that role at the moment, so because we're all kind of doing our own research and our own things too. But at NUH, we're really lucky to have that sort of leadership to then be able to kind of support people with those kernels of ideas, or have those big ambitions about being research leaders themselves.
That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Vicky.
Excellent.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. There are links in the show notes for more information on clinical research in Nottingham, and the website is nuh.nhs.uk/research. Our email and social media links are there too. If you want to stay up to date with the Clinical Research Podcast, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google, wherever you normally get your podcasts. The more shows are rated and reviewed, the more search engines like them, and the easier it is for people to find us. So if you can subscribe and rate and review us, you'll be doing it for science, not just for our egos.